Today's talk is part of our lecture series, Conversations in Forest History. Our guest today is Peg Herring. Peg is an emerita professor of science communication at Oregon State University, and she's the author of Born of Fire and Rain, which was published by Yale University Press last year. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to our guest.
Thank you, Jamie. I wonder if everybody can hear me. This sounds okay. I tell you, this wasn't the world that I thought I'd be bringing this book into. When I first started the project, I wanted to share the wonders of our temperate rainforest with people who might not know only about maybe the gorgeous scenery or our problem with owls. But even then, I could see a growing threat to our forests. Now that worry was like distant thunder at the time, but now that distant thunder has turned out to be a barrage of artillery aimed at the nation's forests. And so this book has become an urgent invitation to explore what it means to be a forest in a rapidly shifting world. I moved to Western Oregon in the 1970s, worked as a salmon biologist and later as a professor of science communication at Oregon State. And all along the way, I've filled these sketchbooks with what I saw, and you'll see some of the sketches today. But I'd like to begin this talk with a bit of forest history. I'm going to quote from my book here. It was the day after April Fool's, 1993, and it was raining in Portland. People lined King Boulevard, clutching their opinions like umbrellas, as a motorcade pulled up to the convention center. A seemingly endless parade of dignitaries tumbled out of the limousines like clowns from a circus car. These were no clowns, and this was no circus. The newly elected President of the United States had come to Portland, along with his vice president, 4 cabinet secretaries, a handful of governors, and the head of the EPA, to mediate the conflict between owls and jobs. The ancient rainforest standing on the horizon, with its fate in the hands of this entourage, shrugged in mossy indifference. These trees had already seen a lot in their time. They were towering when the first Europeans set foot on the other side of the continent, and they were old when Lewis and Clark spent a wet winter on the Columbia River. But by 1993, more than 80% of the old trees had been cut down, and the people who lined the boulevard had strong opinions about what should be done. Inside the convention center, President Bill Clinton heard testimony from the timber industry, rural communities, unions, tribes, and environmental groups. But after listening to all sides, the president saw the conflict was not about jobs or owls or trees. It was about change. And he said, "I cannot repeal the laws of change." Well, the laws of change have dominated this land of fire and rain for millennia. We'll talk more about the result of the Timber Summit later, but first, I've got a geography lesson for you. Well, when I was first proposing this book to various publishers, a typical response was, "Oh, a book about the West Coast forests. That's great. Everyone loves the redwoods." So when I showed them this map of our long, skinny stretch of trees, all they saw were the redwoods down there at the very bottom of the region, because everyone does love redwoods. So this book's introduction had to be quite clear. I had to, oh, here it is. "No," I wrote, "this is not about California redwoods. This story is set a bit farther north in a forest that's often overlooked even by the people who live here. A forest that will surprise you with its incredible beauty and rambunctious character." So some of the folks thought I was talking about the Tongass in Alaska. So I had to be clear. I had to use a different approach to get people to pay attention to our flyover landscape there between Northern California and Southern British Columbia. So this is how I described it. This book is about a magical land at the tumultuous edge of a shifting continent at a precarious moment in history. You will venture behind a curtain of magnificent scenery into a place of gigantic trees, exploding mountains, disappearing owls, an invisible kingdom buried underground, sky-loving creatures that eat light, biblical floods, hellish conflagrations, all across scales from mountain ranges to molecules, and all born of fire and rain. You know, that got their attention, although I was never really sure they got the part about Oregon and Washington. But here we are, halfway between the North Pole and the equator, in what's called the seasonal zone of the largest temperate rainforest in the world. This place is also called the range of the northern spotted owl and the coastal Douglas fir region. And in Oregon and Washington, it's simply called the West Side. But here we have more rain than the fog zone in the redwoods, and more fire than the perpetually soggy cedars up north. This is the sweet spot of the Pacific temperate rainforest. And 10 million people live here on the west side, and very few of them realize they live within spitting distance of a rainforest. And that's not good for anybody. People need to understand the ecosystems in which they live. But to understand this ecosystem, you don't really need a map as much as you need your imagination. And that's because much of the forest that we see today is kept in arrested development and in plantations and tree farms where trees aren't allowed to grow much beyond their adolescence. It's rather dystopian if you think about it. But there still are beautiful stands of wild, uncut rainforest out there. And this is um, uh, the Lewis River Trail in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in southern Washington. But there are similar stands all across the region in national forests and parks. And these are all remnants of one magnificent forest, a forest that rivaled the redwoods with giant trees and prodigious growth, dominated Western Washington and Western Oregon until about the mid 20th century, not that long ago, within my lifetime and perhaps within yours too. And that's important to remember. So imagine, if you will, right now, you're squeezed between a chain of active volcanoes on one side and a massive, increasingly uncomfortable subduction zone on the other, which you are. You are surrounded by a landscape that explodes, burns, slides, and floods, born of fire, drenched of rain, and constantly changing. This is an in-temperate rainforest. That despite all of the turmoil from thousands of years of disturbance, this forest enjoys a distinctly benign climate for growing trees very big and very old. These are Western red cedars at the Olympic National Park. And unlike most other rainforests in the world, giant conifers like these dominate the landscape, much like Earth in the time of dinosaurs. Before the rise of flowering plants and before the rise of mammals, and before the continents drifted into their current locations, there were conifers. And the conifers we have here, Sitka spruce, Western red cedar, Western hemlocks, are the tallest of their kind in the world. And even our deciduous trees, big leaf maple, red alder, black cottonwood, are the tallest of their kind in all of North America. And the one tree that rules them all is the Douglas fir, which is the second tallest of any tree species anywhere on the planet, second only to the coast redwoods, or at least it used to be. I've got a quick story. Steve Sillett, a canopy scientist, and perhaps you know him as the protagonist of Richard Preston's book, The Wild Trees. Steve told me he believes that Douglas fir may have been the tallest tree species, the tallest tree species on the planet. But he said Douglas fir were persecuted even worse than the redwoods. And I'd say Douglas fir was persecuted much worse. Since 1918, Save the Redwoods League has protected more than 200,000 acres of old growth redwoods. There's never been a Save the Douglas Fir League. So the largest Douglas firs were cut in the early 20th century, while the largest of the redwoods were being saved. Everyone loves redwoods, and they should. But despite rampant harvesting in the 20th century, our temperate rainforest still holds huge trees and enormous volumes of biomass and an underground teeming with life, absorbing and storing massive amounts of carbon. And in addition, the rainforest provides more than 40% of the region's water supply. And these are waters that are among the coldest and highest quality in the nation. Hydrologists predict that soon the most valuable product of our West Side National Forest will not be timber, even though we've got some mighty fine trees. It will be water, abundant, clean water. And almost all of this rainforest is on public land. It truly is a public treasure. This is what most of our West Side old growth forests looked like at the beginning of their lives, born of devastation. This is Waldo Lake in Oregon Cascades, a year after a stand replacing fire killed about a 90%, 95% of the trees. But this rainforest has the biological legacy and wherewithal to weather that rough hand of disturbance, if given a chance. Within a few years, the burned forest is a sunny, shrubby landscape. A garden of nitrogen-fixing plants resprout beneath the bones of the burned trees. From the forest's point of view, this is its early childhood. And, like all childhoods, this stage is brief and should not be rushed or logged. This childhood lasts just long enough to re-nourish the soil and allow a young forest to take root. And trees in the young forest are like other adolescents. They're growing fast, they're packing on biomass, and they're reaching for the sky. Their bark is pimply, they compete for dominance, they elbow out the smaller trees and shrubs. It's brutal, like adolescence everywhere. But young trees are vulnerable. They haven't yet developed fireproof bark or natural defenses against invading pests. And they haven't yet developed a fireproof bark, or excuse me, they haven't yet developed uh, uh, good, strong roots, so they have only a tentative grip on the soil, unless they're anchored in a foundation of heavy downed wood left over in the burned forest. Now remember, clear cuts don't leave much on the ground, and certainly not a legacy of big, valuable logs left behind simply to anchor the next generation. But in a forest that's naturally established, life grows on top of life. This nurse stump connects the forest's past with its future. Not so much like a nurse as as a grandparent, passing on the forest's legacy to the next generation. And in a naturally established forest, you might see a chorus line of young trees tiptoeing across the decayed remains of an old grandfather log. With all this magnificent tangle, after about 100 years, the forest no longer looks like a bunch of telephone poles, and that's because it wasn't planted like a monoculture. The maturing trees begin to develop thick bark to resist fire and a complex biochemistry to ward off pests and diseases. The trees will continue to grow taller and wider for hundreds of years more, packing on wood and storing carbon. After about 300 years, these trees begin to sprout heavy lower limbs, like almost like secondary trunks. And these are great protected sites for spotted owls and marbled murrelets, red tree voles, all threatened species. And these secondary trunks grow secondary head full of needles that dramatically increase the tree's rate of photosynthesis. And this is when big trees become giant trees. At about 600 years, the old trees are beginning to show some wear and tear from centuries of disturbance. Their tops are blown out, they have cavities, and parasites, and the delightfully named fungus butt rot. At 800 years, the Douglas fir forest is beginning to lose its oldest members. But even in death, these big old trees continue to contribute to life in the rainforest. This is not the end. And that's because when a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to salvage log it, it starts a parade of strange, busy life in an unseen economy, underground economy. This is the Forest Recycling Center. Here, transactions of goods and services are carried out in a world like Alice's Wonderland, with wild characters in a bustling underground metropolis, busily building new life from the dismantled parts of old life. By the way, this is a diagram of the subway system in Washington, D.C. And some of my colleagues back east told me this is their favorite image from the book, the one that they most closely related to. But all this rot is an essential process. The temperate rainforest, a sign of forest health, not disease. And it's part of why rainforest is less susceptible to fire than, say, the dry pine forests on the east side. And that's not because it rains more here. It's because dry ecosystems, decomposition is slow. So deadwood piles up and dries out, and these dry forest ecosystems evolved with fire to clean house and keep that understory from loading up too much fuel. So you know those beautiful early descriptions of Western pine forests before we started stamping out fires. They described them as park-like, as open forests you could ride a pony through. Well, in our wet rainforest, nobody is riding a pony through thickets of vine maple and salal and devil's club and across piles of logs and downed wood. No, no, this rainforest is naturally packed with plants, both living and dead. The rate of decomposition is not too fast, like hot tropical rainforests that will eat your tent in a week, and not too slow, like the fire-nurtured forests across much of the West. We have Goldilocks decomposition. And as a result, we live in one of the best places in the world to find wild mushrooms and among the highest diversity of moss species on the planet. So think about this. With a deep, damp layers of living soil and vast wet blankets of moss and heavy downed logs that hold water like moisture, like sponges, big standing armored trees, fire-resistant bark. Our wild, wet rainforest doesn't burn easily. But when it does burn, the fire can be fierce. When our rainforest catches fire, it's not because there are too many trees. It's because there's too much wind. Now, fire weather happens in a long-term drought with high air temperatures and low air humidity and a spark, say a lightning strike. You can see why climate change is delivering more fire weather to our region. But it's that hot, dry, hurricane force east wind that can ignite that spark into an inferno. And you can't stop a wind-blown firestorm. So this is what we saw happen in Los Angeles in January. And it's happened in Oregon and Washington and British Columbia many times, recently and in the distant past. So a lot of people are saying now we should treat wind-blown wildfires the same way we treat tornadoes or earthquakes or hurricanes. These are all destructive events that we cannot control, but we can prepare for them. So instead of investing about $4 billion a year on industrial firefighting, which we do, maybe we should spend some of that money preparing vulnerable communities with defensible spaces. Riding the coattails of the LA fires has been a flurry of proposed new legislation calling for increased thinning across the national forests in the name of fire prevention. Now, I can't speak for all forest ecosystems across the country, but thinning trees out of a mature rainforest will not stop a wind-blown wildfire. And that's because thinning makes a rainforest more susceptible to fire, not less. Thinning opens the rainforest to more sun, more wind, and unnaturally high rates of drying. It compacts that deep forest soil and damages the underground life of roots and mycorrhizae. It removes moisture-holding logs, and worst of all, thinning the forest sometimes removes some big trees, too. Some of the most fire-resistant trees in the forest are cut down in order to pay for the logging of the smaller trees. And that's logging that didn't need to happen in the first place. So all this makes the thinned rainforest more vulnerable to fire, not less. Still, I understand wildfire is a deadly, serious issue. It should not be used as a political scare tactic to log our remaining rainforest. Now, let me be clear. It might be a different story with thinning plantations. There are studies that show that thinning monoculture plantations can allow those planted stands to develop more quickly into mature, complex forests that protect biodiversity, store tons of carbon, and cleanse and hold water. But that's not the forest management that's being pushed in the current legislation. During the last 5 months, new federal forest policies propose to open millions of acres of federal forest to increased logging without consideration of environmental impacts because of implied threats of catastrophic fire. These bills suspend the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and a lot of other rules that require scientific review and public comment. Proponents say this will expedite logging and reduce frivolous lawsuits that might interfere with timber sales. But wait, there's more. There are two new executive orders that use make-believe issues of national security to cut more federal timber. And again, their stated purpose is to remove all obstacles, laws, that interfere with fully exploiting our domestic timber supply without consideration of long-standing environmental protections of air, water, climate, biodiversity, and endangered landscapes. Wood might be a renewable resource, but a forest is not at any human scale. You can cut down a 300-year-old forest in a few weeks, and it will take 300 years to grow back, if it grows back at all. So consider how long it, how fast it took for the rainforest in Western Oregon and the Coast Range to be cut down. If you've ever visited Western Oregon and Western Washington, the forest you drive through to get to the beach used to be one of the most productive forests in the world, with trees that rivaled the California redwoods in stature and complexity. Most of that land is privately owned or managed by the BLM. And within my lifetime, the giant trees in that tangled rainforest have been replaced by tree farms of spindly telephone poles. Today, less than 10% of Western Oregon's old forest still stands, and almost all of it is on federal land. We don't have enough public forest left to survive another round of industrial logging. It wasn't this crosscut sow that whittled down our rainforest. It was the one-man chainsaw, introduced to Western Oregon around 1950, and it was the right tool to feed the mid-century building boom with wild caught timber from wild uncut forests. Well, I moved to the Oregon Coast Range in the 1970s when the federal forests were being cut down at a breakneck speed. I saw trucks rumbling out of the hills carrying one gigantic section of a log to the mill, smoldering slash burn piles, and I could see the old forests falling and the salmon runs diminishing. This was the beginning of the owl wars in the Pacific Northwest. So I'll take up a story from the book here. It was 1991, and when we fisheries biologists were shaken by a bombshell report by the American Fisheries Society. It listed 214 stocks of Pacific salmon and sea-run trout that were at risk of extinction. The report authors urged a new ecosystem management focused on habitat structure and function that recognized the importance of salmon and forests together. At the same time, a group of forest scientists at the Andrews Experimental Forest in the Oregon Cascades were developing a similar ecosystem approach to forest management, focused on habitat structure and function for hundreds of species, terrestrial and aquatic. Now, I'll stop here just to emphasize that salmon and forests have together formed the basis of the Northwest economy for thousands of years. And in just 100 years, we're pushing to extinction those two natural sources of sustainable wealth. Back to the book. The 20th century timber industry in the Pacific Northwest relied almost entirely on old-growth timber from federal forests, and it employed 10,000 people. Now, an economic recession in the 1980s had put lots of mills out of business, and the new milling technology had put lots of jobs out of business. However, many of those workers felt most threatened by a bird that almost no one had ever seen. So this is when the northern spotted owl flew into the courtroom and onto the cover of Time magazine. For the policymakers forced to negotiate between owls and jobs, much hinged on the definition of old growth. The suggestions ranged from 80 years to 300 years. Even the name old growth was contested. Environmentalists tell me, many of them young at the time, didn't like the word old. And growth, they said, sounded gross, like something a surgeon would remove. They settled on ancient, but Congress wanted more specifics. The scientists at the H.J. Andrews Forest had been developing a more specific definition of old growth since the 1970s. It included much of what the earlier foresters had, frankly, hated. That was trees of all different ages and stages and species, big old decadent trees and dead standing snags, logs messing up streams and cluttering up the world with habitat. Old growth was not a number of years. The Andrews scientists emphasized old growth is an entire ecosystem. So, while the federal scientists were refining the meaning of old growth, federal judges were refining the interpretation of environmental laws, laws that protected the viability of species and their habitats. But all along, the forest plans stayed stubbornly focused on timber production. Lawsuits piled up. Lawmakers kept asking for scientific studies, and then they just didn't like what was being reported back to them. The old growth issue engulfed politicians on both sides for more than a decade. In 1990, District Court Judge William Dwyer issued an injunction that halted all timber sales on federal lands across the region until the agencies could produce credible plans to ensure the northern spotted owl's viability in the context of the whole forest ecosystem. Well, Congress was fit to be tied. They formed a blue ribbon scientific panel on late successional forest ecosystems with Jack Ward Thomas, Jerry Franklin, Norm Johnson, and John Gordon, plus about 150 more scientists, and asked them to map all the old growth stands in the spotted owl region and evaluate alternatives for conservation. Well, the timber industry called the scientists the Gang of Four, and policymakers still didn't like what the scientists were finding. The fate of the old forests in the range of the northern spotted owl became a flashpoint for the presidential election in 1992. Candidate Bill Clinton promised to hold a timber summit if he were elected, and he was, and he did, less than 3 months into his term. And this began a whole new way to develop science-based environmental policy that would eventually be tested in the national spotlight as the owl wars came to a head. And at the summit, Clinton gave the forest scientists 60 days to draft a plan that would be scientifically sound, ecologically credible, and legally responsible. Those are key words. The summit ended on Friday, and the following Monday, Jack Thomas assembled 100 scientists to begin the work. It was intense. As forest economist Norm Johnson described it, the bureaucratic seas parted and the scientists marched in. The keys to the kingdom were handed over to a group of biologists, ecologists, and scientists, and everybody else was pushed aside. The scientists realized that no compromise could provide both abundant timber for harvest and a high probability of habitat protection. And because habitat protection was the law, timber harvest levels on federal land would have to fall. So the scientists laid out an array of options, and Clinton chose one that would pass muster with the courts, and that became the Northwest Forest Plan. It was an enormous science-based blueprint for managing 24 million acres of federal forests within the range of the northern spotted owl. The plan shifted away from timber production and toward the conservation of old forest ecosystems. It covered more than 1,000 species and placed more than half the land into reserves. Federal timber harvest plummeted to 10% of previous levels, and perfectly engineered tree farms got a messy makeover to look like the landscape that older foresters had tried so hard to eliminate. But you might not have ever heard of it, but around here, the Northwest Forest Plan was the Magna Carta. In years of retelling the drama of those times, Jack Thomas would sum up in 3 words: obey the law. He never lost sight of the intent of those laws to focus on ecosystems and not on individual species. And he knew the difficulties of mixing science and policy. The Northwest Forest Plan continued to guide ecosystem-based management in the region's national forests for more than 30 years. It was one of the first science-based bioregional management plans ever developed for public land, and one of the last. Perhaps the managers were frustrated by having to implement a plan that they weren't involved in drafting. And maybe the policymakers were frustrated by having to accept uncertainty and reduced expectations. But whatever the reason, the keys to the kingdom of management and policy have never again been entrusted to scientists. And now a postscript. After 30 years, the Northwest Forest Plan was thought to need an overhaul. And in 2023, a blue ribbon panel of 21st century scientists recommended amendments that included issues that were barely on the horizon in 1994: climate change, tribal inclusion, wildfire, and the barred owl. In addition, a second executive order extended that hard-earned protection of mature and old forests across all federal lands. Both those proposals were shelved in January 2025. Our rainforest has survived thousands of years of fire, volcanic eruptions, and changing climates, but it cannot survive the chainsaw. A forest is not a tree farm. And this rainforest is worth more standing than cut down. I believe our federal forests are the last best chance that we have to restore a whole, fully functioning forest ecosystem across the Pacific Northwest. But now, environmental laws are being challenged at every level. New proposals to log national forests ignore the laws that Jack Thomas, Judge Dwyer, and President Clinton worked so hard to uphold. The forest of fire and rain is a paradox. It's a forest of life and death, ancient and ephemeral, familiar and mysterious. It lives off buried treasure, and it outlives nations. Yet the forest described in this book exists only in fragments, And only in your imagination can you see that forest as my elderly neighbors saw it when they were children playing beneath enormous trees at the turn of the 20th century. I look at my grandson, pictured here, and I hope he will live to see a rainforest that big at the turn of the 22nd century, because it matters what we leave behind. Thank you.
Well, and thank you, Peg. Folks, if you want to submit a question, please do so in the Q&A forum. And then if you would include your name on that, that would help us track those. Peg, I wanted to ask you a little bit just about your art background, because one of the many outstanding, remarkable things about this book, Born in Fire and Rain, is that you did your own illustrations. And so I'm curious what your art background is, if you had formal training or if you're self-taught. If you could
I've
elaborate a
had,
little bit on that.
yeah, I've had good mentors. I studied art as a minor in undergraduate school, and then science illustration in graduate school. But it's always been the counterpoint to my understanding and passion for science. So I would always take a sketchbook with me, and it was how I observed the world. Photographs don't do it for me, and I'm surprised they do it for most people, because it just takes a couple of seconds to take a picture, a photograph. But it takes time and observation to draw what you see. And to to see that detail is very much like the process of science itself. It takes time to understand an ecosystem, either by drawing it or studying it, but you can't walk through it, snap a few snapshots, and feel like you understand the place. That's why I draw.
Yeah, I get that. I've seen people at scenic overlooks and the like, literally just pull in, roll down the window, take a few photos, back out, and take off. You know,
Yeah,
they're looking at nature through a camera lens, and they're not even. That's all they're doing. They're glimpsing it and then moving on. They're not absorbing it. They're not spending time in it.
right.
Um,
And they miss so much by not standing there. I can look at some of my drawings that I did 20, 30, 40 years ago, and I can remember being there. I can remember what it smelled like or what it felt like to be sitting on a wet log. It, it, the sensory memory is embedded when you spend time and pay attention. And both of those things are transactional. You're spending, you're paying, but it is the reward for that is immeasurable.
okay. Uh, Verna, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce Verna's last name, so I'm not going to embarrass myself or uh, by butchering it. But she brings up the I guess it's current policy. You would know more about this than I. Dealing with barred owls, and that they're at the point now of having to. I think the policy is to shoot them to reduce their numbers in order to save the spotted owl.
Yeah. Not
Um,
actually a policy
in
yet,
the
but it is an experiment that has been going on for a few years in several places within the range of the northern spotted owl. And yes, the proposal is to shoot thousands of barred owls. Um, and let me assure you, nobody wants to do this. It is a heartbreaking place that we have arrived. And I think it's useful to graph the dates of the barred owl's arrival in the Pacific Northwest. It's a beloved bird on the East Coast, but it showed up in southern British Columbia in around 1960. And in Washington, in the first sighting was, I think, in 20, did I say 1960? Yeah, the first sighting was in 1973 in southern Washington. And it was recorded in Oregon and Northern California in the mid 1980s. So you look at those dates and you think about what's happening in the forest and the introduction of the chainsaw. And we cut a welcome mat into the northern spotted owl's habitat for this bird that is very adaptable and can live anywhere and can eat anything, and we just welcomed it in. So we have two victims of this, the barred owl and the spotted owl, that are victims of the consequences of our forest management in the mid 20th century.
Tom Veblen asks if you have any comments on the current Fix Our Forests legislation, and I'll ask you to, if you know about it, to fill us in on what that is, and then provide a comment. And if you don't know what it is, that's fine too.
I
We'll just
don't know
move on
what
to
it is.
another
I'm
question.
embarrassed to say. So tell me.
Okay. I honestly don't know. So Tom, if you want to resubmit with a quick summary of what that is, we'll consider taking it up. Carolyn Jorgen, first of all, says wonderfully insightful presentation and wants to thank you for it. But she asks, she says she's not an expert on the topic of fire nurtured forest and would appreciate having a little bit more information about it in your region that you've been talking about. What I guess I'll ask a different way of what's the ecological role of fire in the forest there, or is that too
Well,
open-ended a question?
the fire nurtured forests are those that are east of the crest of the Cascades in the
Okay.
drier west. And when people think of, oh, those western forests on fire, we need to do something about it, those are often the fires that they're talking about. These are the pine forests. There's lots, it's as complex as anything in forestry. I'm not an expert in all the different ecosystems of the fire nurtured forests of the West. But the temperate rainforest, which that's the region that I am addressing as born of fire and rain. The east of the Cascade Crest I might get 15 inches of rain a year. 50 miles to the west in the Cascades, you might get 100 inches of rain a year. The climate and the ecosystem are completely different. The plants are completely different. And fire in the wet temperate rainforest is a rare and severe event. Fire frequencies are estimated anywhere between 1 and 100 and 300 years. Um, we have seen some big fires. 2020 was a big fire year, and a lot of things burned, including much of the H.J. Andrews experimental forest.
Mm.
Those scientists, after it was really poignant to watch, to be on the outer orbit of that community during that fire in August, September 2020, September. Because the fire raged for a month and they only could get the briefest idea of how much of their research was being burned up. Um,
Mm.
and and a lot of it was. And there were scientists there who had spent their entire career studying, particular streams or particular stands or particular attitudes of that forest, and their study sites were gone. But it didn't take long for those scientists to realize if anybody's going to know anything about fire in the rainforest, it's going to be us here. And so they really poured into establishing new stands, watching the return, and this forest returns after fire. It's adapted to fire. It comes back, and it doesn't burn every 10 or 15 years like the dry fire nurtured forest. It burns much more infrequently, but it can be severe. Um, I think when we talk about destructive wildfires, I have to ask what's being destroyed. And it's often people's homes, people's towns, people's experimental forest laboratories. These are things that people care about, but they are in danger if they are living right at that wildland urban interface. And as the urban part of that interface expands farther and farther into the forest, there's more and more chance for destruction from a fire. So that's why a lot of people are calling for, you're not going to be able to cut down all the trees that might burn, but you can
Mhm.
armor the buildings that are there now and possibly restrict that push farther and farther into that interface with wildland. So that's kind of where we are now with the reality of climate change, reality of fire. But these forests were born of fire and they know how to come back.
Okay. Um, Susan Kindle asks, what would you consider to be the most critical place or places for preservation? Um, Now you've been talking about federal lands, and you did a great job contrasting what's happening on federal with private, but I'm also wondering if you can speak to indigenous lands and where they. So I'm gonna play around with the question a little bit and ask if you're able to speak to the, if you will, a third uh, participant here in forest preservation and participation in land management.
Well, we have excellent examples. I know there are excellent examples in the northern Midwest and other places, but here in Oregon, um, there's two parts to this question. So let me tell you me. Most of my work has been on federal land. That's the piece I know,
Okay.
and that's the piece that I think, because it is publicly owned and this is a public treasure, I think the public land is the place to start preservation. Second part of that question is the value of indigenous land. And I think there's huge inspiration that is happening now. And it is on display at the new Portland airport, which if anybody's flown into Portland in the last 6 months, you will see a beautiful architecture built of sturdy, tight-grained Douglas fir and cedar, I think. Much of that wood came from the Coquille Indian Reservation in the Oregon coast. They manage their timber on a long rotation, as I understand, 80 to 100-year rotation. So they're not harvesting these tiny little adolescent trees that are still just trying to figure out how to stand up straight. They're harvesting big, sturdy trees that have already started to harden into holding up tons of wood. And that is a model for private land wood development. We need wood. And the private land, there's, let me 89% of the timber harvested in the United States comes from private land. And some of it is really well managed, and some of it is not. And in areas where the private land isn't well managed, there's a hunger for more and more of the public land. We gotta just keep on cutting because these people need jobs. People do need jobs and people do need wood. And that can come from well-managed public lands. And the tribal lands, particularly in the Coquille, because I know about that one, is an excellent model for how to manage sustainably timber. I think the Menominee in the Midwest, the northern Midwest, is another excellent example. There are many. So there's much to learn from tribal management of uh, of forest land.
And yeah, they are, yeah. I can't, I was going to attempt to elaborate, but you said it too well. So Richard writes, asks, did the Northwest Forest Plan actually meet expectations? He
You
doesn't
like that.
specify what is that. Is that a fair question to ask?
It's quite a fair question to ask. I think Jerry Franklin was the one who said it did a lot and accomplished nothing. I don't know. I'm paraphrasing, so I shouldn't. It was enormously important, particularly the process and the scope and the outcome that it was an ecosystem-based management. And I think it was important because the scientists who knew the forest better than anybody had a say in its future. Um, it required close collaboration with other uh, forest agencies. It wasn't just the Forest Service doing this and BLM doing this. It was meant to be more interagency. However, the plan promised to provide timber harvest of about 1 billion for board feet a year, which would have been an 80% reduction from the record high harvests during the previous decade. But it turned out the harvest dropped 90%. And over time, the main source of timber was from the federal forests from that restoration thinning, renewing the plantations into something that could possibly grow into a complex forest. The plan offered also uh, economic opportunities to timber towns, but effectively that helped only communities that had the location and the leadership to take advantage of new possibilities. So successful communities, were able to engage with collaborative planning and embraced adaptability, leveraged their natural beauty, but it left behind more isolated towns with more limited options for revitalization. And the plan failed to anticipate the barred owl. Um, that's a big one. And it would have been hard to anticipate a bird that was just beginning to show up in the forest would have that much impact, and not just on northern spotted owls. So barred owl, like I say, will eat anything, and it's eating a lot of other animals that are sensitive species of the old growth forest, who are not used to having a top predator like the barred owl.
Okay. Well, I think on that note, because actually that was going to be my next question. Somebody, Betsy Howe, had asked if you could elaborate more, but on the impact of the barred owl, um, and you just did. So I think with that, um, we'll go ahead and wrap up. So, Peg, thank you very much for this presentation.